Hi, folks. Welcome to our weekly chat about local history. Thank you for joining me. As always, I'm Rob Goller. This week's topic I was had on the back burner for a while to talk about. I get a lot of questions about it, but boy, has it been a busy 24 hours here in East Aurora regarding local history. So I wanted to talk a little bit about it. I bumped up the topic. Um, to catch you up on what has been happening, the new owner of the Roycroft Inn was starting to paint it a color that does not match the aesthetic of the Roycroft campus or the arts and crafts movement, and that got a lot of people in the community concerned. And they were going to paint it white with a black trim, and they're going to, which is not part of the Roycroft palette. And I'm glad to report I posted on the Aurora Town Historian Facebook post page and social media my official statement on it as Town and Village Historian. Of course, I always say the disclaimer on these videos is that although I am the town and village historian, these videos and a lot of my research are not affiliated with my job as town and village historian. But the reason I want to talk about it today is because a lot of the comments that were on social media and that I heard during the last 24 hours about this change at the Roycroft Inn, which is now not going to be a change, but was that it's a National Historic Landmark. How can they do this? How can they paint it a different color if it's a National Historic Landmark? And one of the biggest misconceptions is that there's more protections over National Historic Landmarks than there really are. One of the reasons I was going to originally talk about this and had put it on the back burner of topic ideas was I was at a historians conference, and they had a speaker as part of that conference about landmark status and protections for historic buildings in your communities. And even town and village historians who were in attendance were surprised to learn that buildings and sites that had historic landmarks designations on them weren't as protected as they thought. So even historians who the community historians did not know this. So I've done a little more research into it. I have known some of it, but I was enlightened a lot by at this conference as well as through the research. And then, of course, in the past 24 hours, as we've been talking about the Roycroft Inn, which is a National Historic Landmark as well as designated as a local landmark. So, what's the difference, and why is it important? Well, when you call something a historic landmark, it could mean multiple things, or it could mean nothing at all. And a lot of times you'll hear people say, "Well, it's a landmark. It's a historic landmark," and it may not have any designation. It just has become a landmark through just local tradition. So when you hear somebody say a local landmark, or you even read about something's designated a historic landmark, um, be careful what you assume about it. So there's several different uh, the designation of historic landmark could mean multiple things. National Historic Landmark is the highest designation you can have, and that means that the National Park Service actually administers that program, and you usually have to be designated something before National Historic Landmark in order to be considered for National Historic Landmark. And that means that the site or the building and the structure has national historical significance, that beyond its locale, there are a lot of buildings in our community that we find important, but that the building has national significance to the history and the culture of the nation. And that's very, very rare. What's really rare is a community to have more than one. And here in East Aurora, and of course, what I talk about today can apply to a lot of different communities, but as an example, here in East Aurora, we have the Roycroft campus, which is multiple buildings, and the Millard Fillmore's house that he built in 1826 and lived there till 1830, and is now a museum operated by the Aurora Historical Society. So those are the two National Historic Landmarks here in East Aurora, and that's a pretty big deal because not a lot of communities have that. However, the National Historic Landmark status does not have a lot of restrictions on it, especially if it's owned privately, and especially if there are not federal monies involved in the upkeep of it. So if you use federal funds, so for instance, there's a lot of national landmarks that are operated by the National Park Service. There are a lot of restrictions on those. But if there's no federal money being, and in some cases state money being used to maintain or do a project, or they get a grant, if none of those are there's very few restrictions. So, for example, the Roycroft campus, it had been determined that the Roycroft Inn owner, a private owner now, could paint it whatever color he wants, and there's no limitation on it as a National Historic Landmark. The National Register of Historic Places is the step, they say, step below, and you usually are designated that before you go on to National Landmark status. Those, I'm painting with a broad brush here, but those generally are National Register of Historic Places, are places that have local or statewide significance. That so it's more localized. So we have a couple of those here in East Aurora. The Shida Mantle House on Oakwood Avenue. It's an Albert Hubbard Roycroft Museum. That's a National Register of Historic Places. Baker Memorial United Methodist Church is one of our more recent ones. That it has a regional or a statewide, maybe a limited national. It could have national significance, but it's less significance, broadly speaking, than a National Historic Landmark. Again, a lot of people assume that because something is on the National Register of Historic Places that there are limitations on what you can do. There are some, but in most cases not. And if you go to the National Park Service, actually, there's a frequently asked questions page all about National Historic Landmarks and registered registered historic places. Um, there's a whole frequently asked questions page, and they are very clear that there are not many limitations on what you can do to those properties. Of course, if they're using federal funds and there's grant programs, that's when a lot of those restrictions kick in. So, just because something's a National Historic Landmark or on the National Register of Historic Places does not mean that they are protected. Um, so, one of the, it sounds strange, but actually the local landmark designation has more teeth to it, and even that is limited. Um, so it would seem like your National Historic Landmark, the ones that are considered the most important, would have the most restrictions, and that is not true. And here in East Aurora and in a lot of other communities in the village of East Aurora, we have a local program that's statewide, but we've become a local government that can designate, and there's a lot to this, but broadly speaking, we can designate local landmarks, and we have several here. One of them is the Roycroft campus. So as we were discussing the paint colors at the Roycroft Inn were being discussed, it wasn't the national landmark status that a national historic landmark status that would have been triggered, perhaps. It would have been the local landmark status, which has more restrictions. So when you become a local landmark, if you make changes, you have to get what they call a certificate of appropriateness. Are those changes appropriate for the building? But even that, colors aren't necessarily considered, and I know they were looking into it. But there is more. There are more teeth to local landmarks. So the Roycroft campus, a good example. They're a national historic landmark at the same time that they are a local landmark, and perhaps, but in most cases, the local landmark status is what can restrict what can happen over what the national landmark status. So the national landmark status, as well as the national register status, is more symbolic, and it is important because you can it opens up funding sources. Perhaps it's on the radar of the national government. There are grant funds that are available. Also, if they keep track of those properties, so if something is endangering them, the government, the National Park Service is aware of it. But if the owner, especially if it's a private owner, there's not a lot of restrictions as many people think. So be careful when you think about that. When something is said that it's a landmark, it may not have as many protections. So here locally, we have that mechanism of a local landmark. However, not all the local landmark status, naming something a historic landmark, isn't the only way to preserve something. A lot of the times it comes down to zoning. For instance, East Aurora has a mid-Main district, which is in the middle from Willow down to Whaley, I believe. And there are restrictions in that district to preserve, and that was put in, I think, in the 90s. It's an overlay district where if you want to make, you can't easily take down a building. Um, there are restrictions over trees. So if you take down a tree, I think you have to put two. And again, I'm not an expert on this, but put up two. There are ways to preserve the character of the buildings in that area without naming them a landmark. So there's a combination of things that can be done on a local level to preserve the character in the buildings. Um, without any national or statewide historic designation. So there are other ways to do it as well. So even without landmark status, something doesn't have to be a designated landmark in order to have some protections. And in many communities, um, they've put in zoning regulations and zoning codes, architectural review boards in order to accomplish that goal. Whether you believe that's the way to do it is another story, but and I know some of these things have controversy, but that's a mechanism that a lot of communities use in order to preserve their historic heritage, the buildings, the architecture. Now, oftentimes too, there will be something was designated just by us through our history and through just over time. We call something a landmark, even though it has no historic designation at all. Examples of this is the Globe Hotel here in East Aurora. A lot of people refer to it as a landmark, but it does not have any historic designation. The Circle, um, uh, it's been around since 1936. It's sort of considered a landmark. You say, I'm going to the Circle, everyone knows where it is. When you talk about it, it's sort of a landmark in our community, just based off of the fact that it's unique and that it's been around for a long time. It's got character, and so people will call it a landmark, but it has no designation. And in the town outside the village, there's a lot of great buildings that are landmarks, but don't have any official designation, and people just see them that way. So when you say landmark, be careful what it is. It could mean many, many things, and a lot of times the landmark programs just raise the profile of the buildings and of the sites without any restrictions on what can be done with them. And actually, the local level is where a lot of the actual preservation can happen, as opposed to the national and state level. So the local laws are what really preserve the community's character and the buildings, and that's what triggers some of these discussions that we're talking about, including this week when we were talking about the Roycroft. It was the local law that people were actually pointing to rather than the national landmark status of the building. So surprisingly, it surprised me that the national landmark status doesn't necessarily mean that drastic changes can't be made to it. With this caveat that I'm discussing, I am not an architectural historian. I have a great appreciation for architecture, and I've studied it and history. But I am a people historian. We often joke with our historians groups that we have people historians and architectural historians. Um, so when I walk past a building or inquire about a house, I want to know everybody who lived there. I want to know their stories. I want to know their struggles. I want to know everything they've done. I want to know the people that were in them, more so than the architecture of it. With, of course, I do have an appreciation for it. And then there are other historians who can tell you all the architectural history of a building or a structure. And we kind of joke that there are different historians. Well, I'm a people historian. So as I talk about this today, please remember that I'm not the architectural historian. I've learned a lot about it, but I am by no means an expert, and I would welcome the opinions of other people. I just want to get as I do lots of times with these live streams, is to get the ball rolling on the discussion. So the local history program, actually, as I was asked this week to give comments about what was going on at the Roycroft, the historian does not have any jurisdiction over colors or historic designations unless they serve on the Historic Preservation Board. I do not as historian because I believe I've been asked a couple times throughout my time as historian. I do believe it's a conflict of interest because, but I advise the people who are involved, the Historic Preservation Board, on, do the research into properties. Um, I see that as my role, but to vote on, even though it's an advisory vote, to vote, I just don't think that's proper conflict of interest wise, because I'm doing the research either for the applicant or the homeowner or whatever the property, in addition to the Historic Preservation Commission. And I don't want I don't want anybody to think they're not getting an honest research with it. So I just have chosen. They do a great job. So I don't serve, but I advise. Um, so there is a commission that actually advises the village board on all these matters, and that's who is really the experts on these local historical landmark laws. So, and they have a site with all their members on the village website. And if any community has that local landmark law, you will have a commission like that in that local community. Here in East Aurora, the village has one of those, has a local landmark law. It's called something different, but that for all intents and purposes. And then in the town outside the village, they do not. So no local landmarks are designated outside of the town. But in some communities, the town has a historic preservation board. So in a nutshell, when you call something a landmark, it could mean many things. And so you got to do a little more digging sometimes to figure out whether it's a national historic landmark, a National Register of Historic Places, a a local landmark with under the auspices of the local law, or just something that we call a landmark over time that has no designation, official designation at all, and they all mean something different. No, I know it's confusing, but that's just the way it is. So just when you hear that term, historic landmark, be careful to make assumptions about what can and can't be done with that property. So thank you for listening in. Again, thank you for supporting this project. I really appreciate it. All the research that I do, I really appreciate having people read it and listen. And again, I'm Rob Goller, and we'll see you next time. If you have any great any ideas, all your ideas have been great. Please pop them in the comments, or send me a private message, as you often do. And I do promise, as we start, I said last week, we have a lot of connections to presidential history, and folks have been asking about that, and I promised to get to them. But of course, this week we got a little distracted by something else, but that's okay. That's the way it works. Thanks again. We'll see you next time.